I'm really excited that we're all gathering together with the opportunity to hear about the history of struggle and resistance directly from folks that have been a part of so much of the ebbs and flows of the fight for equality or for reflective and equitable news media. Today, we hope to be able to engage with the legacy of harm that has caused material impacts for Latino families across Colorado, both personally and structurally. And you'll hear a little bit more about that from Polly and Nita today. But we also hope that in naming these truths, we can begin to think about what a future looks like where Latino and Latina Coloradans have access to the critical information they need and that stories that reflect their lived experiences. This builds off of some of the work that you heard from earlier from Laura and Melissa, but it builds off of Collab and CMP's Real Talk Conversations, where they met with journalists and they shared that they felt that newsrooms needed to build stronger and more meaningful connections with communities of color. And it also serves as a precursor to our Latinx Voices working groups. And those working groups will gather Latinx leaders from across the state to identify best practices, practical supports, structural changes, and necessary steps to repair, including potential projects that can lead local newsrooms and information providers to center the stories, experience, and news and information of Latinx Coloradans. So this conversation is just a start, and we're gonna keep working on the issues that we talk about today and make sure that we're continuing to build towards the future that we all want to see here. But I also wanted to mention that this conversation is a small part of a larger conversation around engaging with the legacy of harm that some media systems and institutions have enacted on Latinx, Black, and Indigenous and other marginalized communities. Throughout the country, we have seen journalists come forward to discuss the prevalence of racism in their newsrooms. And even more recently in Colorado, we've heard from courageous reporters about how racism is impacting Latinx journalists and communities at a personal, professional, and systemic level. We've also seen calls to action, asking newspapers to take concrete steps to improve policies and interactions with marginalized communities. The calls and this conversation, although coincidental, were not planned, and they really do emphasize the urgent need for us to reflect and address how media ecosystems and media institutions give Latinx community members, reporters, storytellers, the space and safety to tell the stories that reflect their realities and the realities of Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. Today's conversation about the history of struggle and resistance provides important historical context for how history informs how the systems we are discussing today were created, came to fruition, and function. And I would like to thank you all for being here and for anyone and everyone that has shared and named their struggles and their triumphs, because it gives us power and guidance on how we would like to move forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tina, who's our moderator today. She hardly needs an introduction, but she's an editor, reporter, and coach with the Colorado News Collaborative. She's been a staff writer for the LA Times, Washington Post, the Albuquerque Tribune, but spent most of her career here with us in Colorado at the Rocky Mountain News and Denver Post. She was also the first Latina columnist in Colorado for the major dailies. So with that, I'll say you're in good hands, and I'll hand it over to you, Tina, to introduce our distinguished guests today.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to all the women who have come before me, the women who brought this group together today. I'm super excited about this conversation. I'm super excited to see some of the names that I'm seeing pop up in my chat. I'm not looking at the gallery view right now because it'll distract me. I want to say, I was thinking this morning about how to further frame this conversation, and I want to jump off something that you said, Diamond. As I was thinking about this, the image of an EKG popped into my mind as the kind of EKG tape. So I'm looking at this tape, and this tape is a very long tape. It goes back decades. And on it are spikes, and there's spikes in the 40s, and there's spikes in the 50s, and there's really big spikes in the 60s and the 70s. And then again in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, they come every few years, 5 years, 10 years, we can expect a spike. We're in a spike now. We're in a spike that started with the murder of George Floyd. We're in a spike that was jolted over the last 2 weeks by Lori Lizarraga's column in Westward, by the call to action letter that the Denver Post Newspaper Guild published. And we're in this moment of furor and heat again. And what I want to say as we begin this conversation is that this is not just about 2 newsrooms, and it is not just about 2 weeks. That as we have this conversation, I'd like for you to keep in mind that long roll of EKG tape, those spikes, because that history, that context is going to inform our present. And it's also going to inform how we move forward together in the future, how we, the journalism industry, how we, the community, our relationship moves forward in a healthier relationship, in a relationship that is more than transactional and more than extractive. And so I'm going to get off my metaphor soapbox and move to the rest of the program. And I mean, Polly and Nita really need no introduction, and we're going to drop their bios into the chat. But these are 2 women who I can say personally I've known for, I've been blessed to know for a long time, and blessed because they have inspired me, they have taught me, they have challenged me over the years to think deeper and to think harder. And I know I am far from alone. They are treasures in Colorado. And together, often, they moved in different paths. They had different journeys, but together, when it comes to when it comes to media representation, when it comes to double standards, when it comes to how communities are covered, they have worked within the system. They have challenged that system, butted heads against it. They have, in fact, created entirely new systems. And so really what they did is something that we can learn from. And what they will talk about today, Mo put in the chat something I thought was really interesting, which is she's here to learn and to unlearn. And I want to keep that in mind too as we begin our conversation. So thank you so much, Polly. Thank you so much, Nita. We very much appreciate your time today. I do want to start with this latest spike. I do want to start with what has been happening in the community and the community response to Lori's column in Westward and to the Denver Post call to action, which is a very much a concrete plan of moving forward. I want to know what your reaction is, how you absorb that, how you put it into context. And then we'll go into the long tape.
You know me, Tina, I'm going to jump right in. But given the recent, like you said, Lori's article and then the letter from the Denver Post, I wasn't surprised. I was disappointed and frustrated. But we have not yet we are not yet respected in the same way in media and in journalism. And this has been an ongoing struggle, at least that I've experienced in my life since being raised in a family and raised by my mother and father who are committed to social justice. So we'll get into more discussion. But it is also disturbing that we are at this place again.
I would echo what Nita said. It's just so difficult to realize that that the struggle continues. This has been going on, in my lifetime since the 40s and 50s and beyond. And I keep on thinking we're making progress, and we do make some progress, but then there's that slide backward. And it's hard for me to understand why people, and it's really the dominant society that forgets. They somehow it's a constant educational process. We cannot afford to relax. We have to continue telling our stories and sharing why we are concerned about articles such as the recent issues. So it's a constant struggle.
if we took this kind of long history and I forced you both to really kind of summarize in maybe a couple of sentences the nature of the relationship between local media in all of its forms and communities of color, and today particularly the Latino community, how would you characterize that relationship?
Well, as a Chicana Mexicana growing up here in Denver, being raised within the movement, the Chicano movement, and the Crusade for Justice, we didn't enjoy a relationship with media that truly told the story from our perspective and our lens and our history. In fact, if you were an activist and you were progressive and you were marching in the streets against injustice and discrimination, if you read articles from that time, we were demonized. People lost jobs because they stood up. Many of us, including me, were bullied at school because we were involved in the Chicano movement. And we saw media as part of the oppressive system, as part of the colonization of our people. And so in response to that, we took action against media. In fact, it was Rodolfo Gonzales in the Crusade that said, well, damn it, if you don't want to tell our stories, you don't want to cover who we are, you don't want to know our truth, we'll be responsible for that. We'll do it our way. And so El Gallo was born. Aslan Bookstore was born. Joaquin Publication was born. So, and then lastly, in the late 70s, Raza Association of Media Advocates was born. But this was an organization, an association that didn't dance to the tune of the system. This was an organization that confronted the media and journalistic system and wasn't afraid to do it and stand up.
So if you're summarizing it and you're saying, what is the nature of this relationship over time? Is it contentious? What's the word that how do you summarize it?
It is insulting. It is demeaning. It is disrespectful. That relation still exists. And let me add to that a little bit, Tina. Although we began to enjoy seeing people with names like yours in newspapers, in television stations, and radio stations, what we forgot is to keep the connection with the community, because what we could do as a community, working in partnership with our journalists, with our reporters, if the station wanted to mess with them, we would bring out a whole community. We'd boycott. We'd protest. And those representative or those that look like us and have our name, and we don't have a relationship, when something like this happens, that happened to Lori, we didn't know till Lori wrote the letter. Why is that? Because there was a disconnect, that the community could not then rally in a way that would force a station not to take that kind of action.
I'm about 10 years older than Nita, so my experience is a little bit precedes the movement years. I grew up in Greeley, Colorado, where the local newspaper treated us, really divided our community, because it used words like, if you were being complimented about something, you would be Spanish. If you were being if you would maybe encountered the police of some sort, you were Mexican or wetback or illegal. So those terms were used depending upon how we were being viewed, even if we came from the same family. We were divided, and that was used in a very demeaning way, but also very divisive. In our community at the time, it made you feel less than. It wasn't a question of being ashamed of the community. It was a question of being ashamed of how you were reported in the newspaper. The newspapers made you feel like you weren't as good as other people. And so as a child, I remember feeling that I had to work twice as hard to be as good as, and to a certain extent that was positive, because I did work harder than anybody else in order to get a scholarship to go to college, because certainly we were in our economic situation was such that we couldn't afford to go to college without scholarships or assistance. But it was the words that I would use would be demeaning and divisive. And I came along in the movement. Actually, my first picket line was in 1962 with Nita's father, when we were picketing the Denver Police Department because of a young man who had been shot in the back. He was the cousin. I was a playground supervisor at the time, and he was the cousin of one of the students that was on a playground. So that's when the concern started to we had to somehow gather together. And then later on, I did go back east right out of college because, quite frankly, I couldn't find a job in Colorado, although I graduated with honors from CSU. But I got a job in Washington, D.C., putting out a labor union newspaper.
And either of you point to any specific recollections, examples? You've spoken kind of generally of feeling of being demeaned or rendered less than, but are there specific examples that you can think of in terms of coverage or depiction?
Well, no, we clearly, Tina, in that day and age, in that time of the Chicano movement, we clearly recognize the power of media and how it informed people's opinion of other people. And but the difference was the movement. I grew up in a time where I was involved in the crusade in the Chicano movement, and my father said, "Ya basta, we're not taking this anymore. They're not going to be able to just get away with the kinds of demeaning stories and stories that were not factual. And act like you just have to accept it." So I remember being a little girl on boycotting the Rocky Mountain News. And we did a picket line in boycott for well over a month because of the articles and the way they depicted my father and other Chicanos who were beginning to speak up and stand out and stand up. So that's when I learned that. So see, we grew up, we were socialized to believe that whatever you read in the paper was true, or whatever you heard on the radio or saw on TV. And my father would say, "No, hell no. That's not true when it comes to us." So that's when I got that's when I got the ganas and was encouraged to always stand up, always speak out, not to take anything for granted, and definitely not let anyone else tell our story or my story. So I felt really proud to boycott the Rocky Mountain News. I said, "Yeah, they're not Jesus Christ. They're not God. And why should they have the last say on who and what we are?" And you realize, as part of the movement, we changed calling ourselves Spanish or Hispanic or Hispano. We were Chicano. We created the term that would identify who we were. The Chicano movement in Denver, Colorado, and across the Southwest ignited that identity and pride in us, as well as ignited that desire to confront injustice and inequality wherever it stood.
Thank you, Polly.
What I remember the most was that had to do with the media was the late 60s, leading into 1970, when we were trying to impact the media, because there were no reporters that were Latino on the major newspapers. There were no copywriters or folks employed by the media that looked like us. We were starting. Well, Ruben Salazar was the first reporter that worked first Latino that worked for any major newspaper, and that was the Los Angeles Times. And I was working with Ruben because at that time I was the director of research and education for the Southwest Council of La Raza. And we were trying to gather together people from all, reporters, all the editors of all these newspapers, like Nita was talking about, these small newspapers that were starting to talk about the difficulties in our community. and we had gathered together to try to form what we called the National Chicano Media Coalition. And we actually got as far as New York to be invited by, well, Ruben was the one that organized the meeting, where we went to speak to the heads of the major, the New York Times and the major news networks, ABC, NBC. They sat with us. There were about 15 of us that went to that meeting. And Ruben, at the time when he was sharing how we were being depicted in the media with Frida Bandido and Nita Gonzales and all those images that made us look like we were drunk and lazy, and the Mexican under the
Cactus.
the raw pig cactus. Yeah, I mean, it was so demeaning. And he was sharing that with these national heads of media corporations. And at the very end, he said, if you don't change the way we are viewed in the media, there will be blood in the streets. And I remember that because I wrote an editorial about it later on. But it was only, that was in June, July, 2 months later, almost to the day was when Ruben was killed during the national moratorium against the Vietnam War in Los Angeles.
In which my father attended, and was arrested.
It was a gathering of all the key leaders, and including Corky, and it was and he was killed by a policeman when he went in. I was so involved with Ruben because it was that day that he died that he was elected the chair of the National Chicano Media Coalition, and I was elected the secretary. So I was always taking all the notes. But Ruben had just gone into a bar with his cameraman to eat, and a rumor went around, a myth went around that there was some problems there, and a policeman shot a tear gas pellet into the restaurant without any warning, and it hit Ruben in the temple and killed him. But at any rate, we've had a lot of challenges, and when I came home after that, when I left the Southwest Council, I was the executive director of the Colorado Committee on the Mass Media and the Spanish Surname, and we were trying to, and we did launch some challenges, to the local media, and we were able to get Channel 7 to give us a half-hour television program, but it was such a struggle. It was so difficult, to get the media to understand how dangerous it was to misrepresent us in the media. Both the print and broadcast media.
So,
and it's still happening.
At this same time, then, Nita, what's happening in your world at this parallel time? Is this when Rama is starting? What's happening at this time?
Well, actually, what it started first was El Gallo by the Crusade for Justice, and as a result, and that was one of several newspapers across the Southwest, which were alternative newspapers, started and written and published by our community, by Chicano activists in the movement. And from that, at the same time, so you have to understand, media had its place, but the greatest emphasis around the movement was the emphasis around human rights and social justice. Media was the tool by which we felt we could accomplish that, by informing and educating community around the actions we took that newspapers and radio stations and TV stations demonized us for. I mean, let me tell you, we'd have marches and the Ku Klux Klan would march alongside of us, and they'd give more credence to the Ku Klux Klan than to our rallies and marches in Denver, Colorado. They never wanted to believe our side or even wanted to ask our side. The media didn't. So that's why we started our own instruments, our own ways of coming together. And as a result, Raza Association of Media Advocates was started in the late 70s to combat that. more directly. But I want to say this right now. I want to say that it was the movement that created the impetus. And Ruben Salazar said the same thing to my father in LA, that had there not been a Chicano movement, he would not have the position he had. If there had not people in the streets, they would not have opened the doors. And I want to honor those in our own community that were hired. There was Jeannie Holguin, there was Frank Moya, there was Ed Romero, there was George Sandoval. In fact, Channel 4 did Mi Linda Raza because of the Chicano movement and because Rama filed a suit against Channel 4. And then they asked George to please come on and bring us all together. And Marsha West was the producer and fought with Channel 4 to have Mi Linda Raza. And it was in Mi Linda Raza that I learned to produce. I produced the TV program. I would get, as a producer, you do all the work, get all the people and help make George look good on camera. But the difference is the bent in terms of that program was to bring that story of self-determination, that story of social justice, that story of inequity to the screen. And George was wonderful about doing that as well. He tolerated me in a lot of ways, but I appreciated his willingness to be there. Nowhere else in any program did they talk about AIM, American Indian Movement, or Wounded Knee. It was on Mi Linda Raza because there was no other venue to do it. Or about the Trail of Tears, because we had the connection with American Indian Movement and we always saw ourselves as relatives. And whatever we were going to be involved in as Chicano movement, we were going to ensure Indigenous people were at the table, since we were also of them.
And it was also George that helped us get a program on 7 called Quinto Sol that I was the moderator for at the before I ran for office, but I had to retire when I ran for office. And then Miguel, my former husband, and then Romaine took it over. But we had a lot of struggles, and we were making a lot of progress in the 70s and the 80s before the Fairness Doctrine was discontinued, because it was during those years too that we had this muscle from the Chicano movement that caused the media, I think, to. And because of the Fairness Doctrine, we could talk about we needed equal time, as other communities, and we pushed for that, and we had that influence and that muscle. But in my opinion, with the demise of the Fairness Doctrine, the media didn't feel responsible to represent us anymore, to respond to us.
I want to ask you, for them, for me, for us, if you're thinking about what is a healthy patient of the future, right? That EKG that's not spiking all over the place every few years. What is a healthy relationship? What is a genuine, authentic, choose your word, relationship with the media look like? How do you define that? What does it look like?
Respect. It's important that our community be respected and understood to this degree, that we are a diverse community. We aren't all alike, and that's okay. But we ought not, as any particular group of people, because we're as there are as many differences within our community as there is between communities. But the respect and honor and try to understand that we are a diverse community.
I think for me, it's that when I will see, I think for me it will be when I see, Tina, like-minded, no, let me strike that. When I would see people that not only look like me and can speak Spanish or both languages, but on the editorial boards, writing the articles, because right now it's predominantly white male. How are you able to inform what you're writing and what you're speaking about if you don't have that you don't have that experience or that cultural connection. And so I think for me, it's about, Polly's right, it's the diversity, but I'm going to be a little bit stingy. You know what? People talked about affirmative action and they were upset about it. And why do we need it? Colleges had to combat it. Well, I'll tell you why, because white people have had affirmative action for 500 plus years. This is our homeland. And when you disrespect us in our own homeland, how do you connect? The bridges that you create, Tina, and other journalists that are willing to do that, that are humane and respectful and informed, is one thing, but that number is too damn small. And it's getting smaller. When you talk about what happened with Liz and Channel 9, when you talk about what happens at newspapers and editorial boards, till that changes, I don't know what relationship we'll have. I'm of the mindset I like collab because to me it's an alternative way of telling the story or reporting the news than what we're used to seeing. So I'm frustrated. I'll tell you, I don't pick up a newspaper. I do get on the internet and I'm going to look at, Mexican reporting and BBC and international reporting, because I feel like we're so limited right now.
If you were to look at one area where things seem to have gotten better, what would you say?
Well, I still don't see. Go ahead, Nita.
No, Polly, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I still don't see Latinos, in the reflected in the media, in a prominent place as newscasters or as programmatic. I watch the news all the time, and yes, there has been improvement. I am seeing more reporters, but we're still not there. When I watch the national media, it's pretty lacking. We don't see ourselves very often. Mm-hmm. And even the progressive stations, like MSNBC, let alone the more conservative stations, you don't see us on the primetime news programs. And in the newspapers, I don't see as many bylines as I'd like to see, that I think are important. And it's not about having one or two reporters. It's about having reporters from our community that represent, different parts of the community. You have to have a good number. Call that I'm spacing out the term right now. Critical mass.
Point.
A critical mass.
Well, and I want to just say, I think I agree with Polly. I think there has been a change. I didn't think in my lifetime, particularly after George Floyd protests and similar protests, that you would have mainstream media, television, radio, acknowledging there was systematic racism. I didn't think that would happen. But given that, I think I know that we have a lot more work to do. And I agree with you, Tina. It's not about I'm tired of the spike and then we level out and then the spike. There has to be a point where we have the kind of energy and enthusiasm and environment that respects diversity, respects communities of color, respects us. And I refuse to say we're a minority. I've never used that term. We are more and more in this country becoming a very diverse and very brown community. And so you can't continue to have a media that ignores that, disrespects that, hopes it'll go away, because it's not. In fact, wouldn't you want people in your organization that have that lens, that have that experience, that have that cultura, and that have that ability to inform your organization's journalism, writing, and reporting? And we have to come to
And
that place.
It would be good for your bottom line, because you'd have a lot more folks. As the community grows, there's been a tremendous growth, in the communities of color. They're reading newspapers too. They're looking at television and listening to the radio. And so I think it's a community that frankly, the media needs to reach out to for their own sake, for their own growth, for their own bottom line.
Thank you.
Or we'll do what my dad, I encouraged to do what the Chicano movement and my dad did. Said, well, you don't want us, we'll do our own. We'll create our own.
And I want to actually, I want to jump to the questions, at some of the questions that we're getting. And this is actually a question that comes from Senator Julie Gonzales. And she and the rest of the jefas have been very involved in reaching out and demanding change. And she asked this question about a tactic, which I'll just read off my phone. Nita, you mentioned the boycott of the Rocky Mountain News back in the day, and I'm curious to learn more of your and Polly thoughts regarding withholding stories as a tactic. And for my part, in light of recent events with 9 News, I am choosing to instead speak with reporters and outlets who reflect the diversity of the community, both in the newsrooms as well as the type of stories they tell. So a form of boycott in withholding stories as a way to force change.
I'm not so sure I would withhold stories. The reason is, I think it's so important that we get our stories out. I guess I've always been, from the time that I recall, I put out a newspaper in Washington, D.C. for a labor union. And I remember trying to get stories and was so grateful when sometimes I would go to the Hill and they talked to me. And so I understand the importance of getting stories. And let me share an example. When I was the executive director of La Raza, the Southwest Council of La Raza, and I think it was 2003 that Tom Tancredo was doing his bit about immigration. It was getting to be a real serious issue. And I had just started at the South, not the Southwest Council. This is La Raza. I'm getting my jobs mixed up. This is at the Latin American Research and Service Agency when I was the executive director. That was 2003. And I was called by a reporter, a Latino reporter, that said he was doing a story on Tancredo's introduction, or he had said something about immigration. I don't remember exactly what the story was about, but he said, I need your point of view. And I said, I just started this job. I'm really busy trying to, we've had a lot of issues and I'm just really busy right now. And he said, Polly, if you don't talk to me, I won't get the opposite point of view, because I've asked some of the legislators and nobody's talking to me about this. So unless, if you don't want that point of view expressed, I said, no, I'll talk to you. So I did. And so I became then a voice on immigration, because it's important to get our story out. And so I've always done that. And I still do.
Well, so this is my feeling. While I don't disagree with your strategy, Polly, I quite frankly know that we haven't made change in this country because we have appeased those in power. We've made change in this country because we have picketed, because we have boycotted. We wouldn't have had Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta wouldn't have had success if they didn't do both hand in hand. So I'm not saying you don't, but I am saying you remind them, but we do have people power. we have economic power, and that if you are not going to listen to us, guess what's going to spring up outside your door? And that will be the news media. That will be the news article. And so I do see people power as integral to making change in this country. Just doesn't happen legislative policy changes because people demand that it change.
So I'm going to jump then to this is a related question from Jenny Brundine at CPR. Given the fragmented nature of media and communities right now, do you think there is sufficient organizing power within Latino Chicano communities in all their diversity to push media outlets to improve coverage?
I believe that we're in a critical place, and we can utilize this time to energize and support our positions and take an action. But it will take people being willing to come together to do it, to kind of leave at the door whatever differences, to say this is the greater good and this is the work we need to do. I've been an organizer all my life. That's what I love doing. And part of organizing is getting people to come together around those issues critical to them, to their community, to our people. And we've done it effectively at times. But like, I loved your EKG kind of metaphor, but it's like spike and we'd get really involved around the issue, and then we go away. I think we have to learn to sustain that movement, to sustain action. So then we will be respected and know that we will act. So you can't just continue to do business as usual without having people respond in a way that could be very detrimental, as Polly said, to your bottom line as well. I always say to the bottom line. Oh, and I cannot forget, I have to also honor Paco Sanchez. He was the first one with the Spanish language radio in the area, and he fought all kinds of challenges to do that. So I have to say that.
Yeah, thank you, Nita. What I've seen over my lifetime is a kind of a cyclical event. We make a lot of progress, and then there are challenges and backsliding. And then there's another cycle that comes, and with us organizing again. And what I've seen is that the second cycle or the next cycle always has the potential of doing so much more. And I think right now, that point in time where our community is on the upward swing a lot. And that's because of some of the great people we have in our state legislature now. We have more people serving in the state legislature today, more Latinos than we've ever had in the history of Colorado. And we have those Latinos in leadership position, which is, we've got some good positions like Senator Gonzales and Representative Serena Gonzales Gutierrez. Leroy Garcia. Wow, I'm having difficulty, but I'll always remember Julie Gonzales. She's my senator. But the point is, these great leaders, and so I want the upward swing. We are on the upward swing. We can make great progress now.
Well, and I believe, Polly, I agree with you, but I would want to say that these Chicanas, because that's what they call themselves, Chicanas, are daughters of the Chicano movement, and they grew up in that place of taking action, and they're not afraid to. That's the thing. We have got to get, we have to know that fear is our enemy. We cannot be fearful for standing up for what's right and what's just.
I want to get in a couple more questions, and I just lost it. It was from Mike Booth. Hold on a second. Mike, where'd you go? Oh, here it is. It's our job when in a position to hire to make sure employees reflect the whole community. That's not a responsibility we should push off on others, but we can always use better advice. How can we be more effective in broadening staff and finding talented candidates?
I believe I mentioned somewhere along the way here today. Tina, where it is critical to maintain a relationship with community. When you divorce yourself from community, even your own community, then it's hard to find maybe the have people that would be willing to consider hiring from that community. It's a difficult question because it shouldn't it be the intention of the organizational heads to have, shouldn't it be intentional that they would go out and want to recruit and hire or home grow talent? I mean, schools do it. They take paras who are bilingual, and schools pay for them to become teachers because it's easier to get them certified as a teacher than to teach them a second language. I mean, why isn't that happening? That used to happen during the 70s, I think, Polly, right? They had a number of these internship programs for community folks. I know in television and in radio, I'm not as sure about it in newspaper or journalism in that sense.
The problem was with a lot of those internships back in the 70s when I became aware of it. They were non-paid, and our community needs to have paid positions. They need to have paid internships, and you need to invest in our community in order to get what you really want. And that means you invest by having some paid internships, and then I think you would find we have a lot of talent, in our community, but it comes from a recognition that, the media is the entity that needs to represent all communities. And as communities of color grow in percentage of the population, that should be reflected in the media in order to have an honest reflection of what's going on in our communities. And so, paid internships, outreach in terms of job fairs, it's been done before. It can happen, and maybe we need to learn from the movement days when it was happening, in the 70s and the 80s, that a lot of good talent is out there, but you need to be
right,
push doors to that talent, and then nurture them, mentor them, and help it happen.
Well,
and we'll get
but you also have to have you have to have the commitment to want to, and I don't see that in this, and I don't see that in media leadership, unless I don't see that there's a commitment to say what Polly said. I want to have interns that will home grow. I want to reflect the population that the community we're serving. And I've never known them to move until we threaten boycott. We threaten the bottom line.
So we're running up against time. I want to encourage people, if you're not reading in the chat, excellent conversation going on in the chat, really good points being raised. As we get ready to go into breakout rooms, I want to ask each of you if there is a last thing you want to say, a thought that you want to send people away with, something to ponder, something that kind of pulls us all back into focus. What's the message you want people to take away?
Well, for me, my message is that we are stronger than we've ever been if we can unify and support each other. If we can unify what I believe we have, the power, the intellect, the spirit, to make the changes we need to see in all elements of our society, in all elements. Media is one piece of that, although a very important piece. So I would hope that we can come together and resolve this and take on issues and not be fearful of that. Know our strength, our communal strength, our spiritual strength, our economic strength, and use it wisely to make the change we want to see. But that can happen unless we're willing to act, not just talk, not threaten, but act.
We live in an amazing democracy, and it's being challenged right now. And I have great fear for our democracy. Our founders developed some good instruments, but it wasn't perfect, and it still isn't. And so we need to make sure that this democracy responds to the communities that are part of this country. That if you ignore and diminish and disrespect, demean part of our population of this country, there will be blowback. There will be, and as Ruben Salazar said in 1970, August 29, June 1970, you will see blood in the streets, because you have to respond to the communities you serve. The media has a real responsibility to reflect and respond to all the different communities in this country. And a growing part of our population, of our democracy, is the communities of color. And it's so critical that those communities are represented in all parts of our democracy. And if they are not, if they are shut out, as some are attempting to do with terrible legislation that would suppress voting rights, if they are shut out, that's when there are problems. The media needs to be a part of including those communities as part of our future, as part of the valid voices in a democracy.
Great conversation. I felt like we could still talk for another hour, and I feel like what was happening in the chat was awesome and really important. And so again, I thank you both for sharing your insight with us and challenging us.
Thank you, Tina, and thank CoLab. I also want to say I'm very proud of you, Tina. Thank you for being there.
Thank you.
And so am I.
Thank you.
Proud of Tina. And thank you.
I just want to re-emphasize and show love in the chat as I'm announcing the instructions for our breakout groups, how important this conversation was and how many important points of history that we just got to hear in the short 45 minutes. I was live tweeting quotes from you all, and I'm definitely going to be looking at the recording for sure. So thank you to you both, and thank you, Tina.